So now we're getting into the meat of the collaborative class. We're going to be looking at what I'm going to call the free will challenge to meaningfulness. Now, this is a version of challenge 3 from lecture 1. So if you recall, in lecture 1, I gave you a version of the dilemma of determinism. This was made famous by the American philosopher William James, though I think versions of that kind of reasoning exist in earlier philosophers such as David Hume. These historical points aside, I want us to focus on the challenge. So I've tried to put the challenge in terms of a valid argument. I hope it's a valid argument. I'm pretty sure it is. And we're going to go through each of the premises, and we're going to see how you might respond to this argument, and this argument in standard form that I think accurately or does well to represent the free will challenge to meaningfulness. So the first premise is that everything is either determined or undetermined. This just seems trivially true. If things are either determined or not, there's no in between. If something happens, it's either the result of determination or the result of indetermination. Determination and indetermination are incompatible with free will. This is our second premise. Note here that I'm using determination and indetermination rather than determinism and indeterminism. Now, determinism has various forms, and it's usually the view that the whole world, the whole universe is determined. Likewise, with indeterminism, it just means that the whole world isn't determined. So everything could be 97% determined and 3% undetermined, and then indeterminism would be true. I want us to focus less on the whole universe and just on particular causal chains, particular situations. If there's an instance of determination, it just means that everything leading up to a particular action was determined. And if there's indetermination, then things running up to a particular action weren't fully determined. Now, the second premise is going to say that determination and indetermination are incompatible with free will. So the question there is that, can you have free will even if you're in a deterministic causal chain or an indeterministic causal chain? We're going to look into that in a little bit more detail, but it does seem that if everything's either determined or undetermined, and then determination and indetermination are incompatible with free will, then we lack free will, because there's no possible situation where we have something that would give us free will. We're always in a situation where there's a lack of free will, either being in a determined situation or an undetermined situation. So from premise 3, we get premise 4. We're going to introduce premise 4. It doesn't follow. We're just going to introduce it. 4 says, if we lack free will, we're never able to add anything to the world. And this was something we talked about in lecture 1 very briefly. Premise 5, if we cannot add anything to the world, our lives are meaningless. Thought there being that to have a meaningful life, you have to be able to add something. You have to add something to the universe, add something to the world. And 6, conclusion, so our lives are meaningless. So from 3 to 5, 6 is supposed to follow. So 3 supplies the antecedent to 4, and then the consequent of 4 supplies the antecedent to 5, and then the dominoes drop and 6 follows. This, I hope, is a good representation of the free will challenge to meaningfulness. So we're going to focus on premises 2 and 4. We're going to look in particular at a form of compatibilism, or really semi-compatibilism, from a philosopher called John Martin Fisher, and you read his article. It's a bit heavy going in certain places, the article, but I hope the main points come through. And I really want to give you some of the background to the article to help some of the earlier parts hopefully make a bit more sense, a bit more contextualization. So in Fisher's form of compatibilism, we don't need alternative possibilities. What we do need instead is a kind of responsive agency. And that agency has to have the right kind of history. And in this account, for Fisher, determination and indetermination do not rule out what he calls guidance control. For him, guidance control is the more important notion. When we have guidance control, we act freely in a sense. And when we act freely in that sense, we're going to be able to make our lives meaningful by writing a sentence in the story of our life every time we exercise guidance control or act freely. So let's think a little bit more about the details of this account. So a normal way of thinking about free will is to think that you have genuine choices. So if you reach a fork in the road, you can either go left or right. And you've got a genuine choice about which you take. But for Fisher's view, no forking paths like this are really necessary. While you might see yourself as having an open choice, you don't really need a choice that could really go either way. You have to believe in some level, you have to think, oh, you can still weigh up the options and think about which to take. It doesn't have to be open in some kind of metaphysically deep sense. It can still be determined. It can still be the case that, it's determined you're going to go left rather than right. But Fisher thinks you can still have guidance control in this case. And the way he does this is he thinks that it makes more sense. There are certain arguments that you'll cover in 2A, if you do 2A on free will next year, certain counterexamples to what is called the principle of alternative possibilities. And that's supposed to undermine the idea that we need alternative possibilities for moral responsibility and guidance control. We're not going to get into that here. Rather, I want to focus on the details of Fisher's account, because the details of his account still give us a plausible way of understanding how we can have a kind of control, even if our actions are determined or undetermined. And this is in terms of responsive agency, which Fisher calls his particular account of responsive agency is moderate reasons responsiveness and having the right kind of history. And he calls this ownership in that paper. So let's think about moderate reasons responsiveness. The details of it are a little bit more complicated than this, but here's a simple way of getting to grips with it. Suppose you wanted to go to the best university in Scotland. Now, quite clearly, Glasgow is the best university in Scotland. So, but if it had turned out that Edinburgh were a better university, and your guiding belief was that you wanted to go to the best, your desire was to go to the best university in Scotland, and you believed Edinburgh was the best university, and it in fact was, then you would have gone there. But since Glasgow is the best university, you went there. The thought here with responsive agency is that you would have done otherwise had things been otherwise. So the reason you go left rather than right is that you had some preference towards going left. But if going right at the fork in the road had been more attractive for some reason, you'd have gone there. You were never sort of fated to always go left. Your agency is responsive to features in the world. You had some purpose in going left rather than right, so that's why you went left rather than right. So let's now look at the ownership condition that Fisher talks about. So this is a historical condition, and for Fisher, what matters is you have the right kind of history. So having the right kind of history means that one is properly related to the aspects of mind that lead to one's actions. So when we act, we normally act from beliefs, desires, values, cares, other aspects of mind, things that, you act from your desires to get something from the fridge. I'm thirsty, I desire a drink, go to the fridge. You believe there's a drink in the fridge, so you go there. These aspects of mind are all implicated in that action. And for Fisher, he thinks it's important that you own those aspects of your mind in a particular way, the mechanisms that lead to action, he calls it. And these all involve mental states like beliefs and desires. When we have the right kind of history for Fisher, then we own those aspects of mind, those beliefs, desires, values, and cares. And roughly, you have the right kind of history for Fisher if you're a normally functioning adult with a normal life history. You'll have that kind of thing. Because for Fisher, having the right kind of history, owning your mental states, is a matter of taking responsibility. For him, taking responsibility is a technical term to mean seeing yourself in a particular way as the cause of your actions and seeing yourself as an appropriate recipient of attitudes like praise and blame. But for our purposes here, we just have to think that the historical condition is met by all normal functioning human adults with normal life histories. So everyone here satisfies Fisher's historical condition. Now, Fisher holds that we can have a kind of control, what are called guidance control, regardless of whether our actions are determined or undetermined. So if we live in a deterministic universe, we can still have guidance control. If we live in an undetermined universe and an indeterministic universe, we can still have guidance control. And if our lives are part of a particular deterministic or causal chain and we're subject to determination, or they're part of an indeterministic causal chain, we're subject to indetermination at some point in that causal chain, then Fisher thinks we can still have guidance control. So he doesn't think that either determinism or indeterminism necessarily rule out control. He thinks that certain kinds of indeterminism might, if there's genuine luck, but it's not in and of itself. There's nothing about being undetermined in how we act or being determined in how we act that rule out guidance control. So that things might have been different doesn't matter if you still exercise guidance control. So when things are undetermined, they can go one way or the other. And the fact that you know, go left for the same kind of reason you would have gone right doesn't really matter because you could still exercise guidance control. So the metaphor that Fisher uses is of a glider. So imagine a glider going on the wind. Woo-hoo. Imagine you're piloting the glider. Now you choose to go left and the wind takes you left. Woo. You choose to go right and the wind takes you right. In this, Fisher thinks you still have guidance control. It's still you at the controlling thing, even though the wind is ensuring that you go left or right when you choose to go left or right. Guidance control is supposed to be similar to this. We're being pushed around by the forces in the universe, but we still have the right kind of agency, this responsive agency with the right kinds of history that mean that we're still having an important role in the universe. Now, if Fisher's right and his account works, then he can respond to premise 2. He can show that premise 2 is false. He can show that determination and indetermination are incompatible with free will. Now, discussion 2, I want you to think about this. Do you think determination and indetermination are incompatible with free will? So do you agree with premise 2? Now think about guidance control. Do you think that amounts to free will? Fisher himself sometimes talks about acting freely, sometimes not. He's a semi-compatibilist because he doesn't think that alternative possibilities are compatible with determinism. And sometimes he thinks of guidance control as free will. But what do you think? Does that line up with your conception of what free will is? You know, imagine being pushed around in the glider. If that's the kind of agency you have in the universe, are you exercising free will? Is that what guidance control is? Third, can you think of any objections to Fisher's view? I don't want you to worry about anything he says in his article at this point. Just think about any objections that might have come up in your thinking about this view and your understanding of it.